If there's one term in photography that I really dislike, it is negative space. I think from a beginner's perspective, it can lead you to believe that space in photography is a bad thing, when in reality it's absolutely vital. That's why in this video I not only want to share with you 3 scenarios where negative space can have a positive impact on your photographs, but I also want to share with you my top tips for constructively using space in your photographs to make them pop. So for some reason I decided that coming out into the Yorkshire Dales on a very dull, cold day would be a good idea, coming in search of this barn and stream so we can put these techniques into practice and hopefully prove that negative space in your photographs can be a really positive thing. I like to think of space in a photograph as a little bit like the punctuation of photography composition. It allows us to take a breath, to separate out various different elements within our frame and ultimately make our photograph appear a little bit more coherent. Imagine a paragraph without any full stops or commas. It would just be a garbled message and be rather confusing. And a photograph without any space has exactly the same effect. Negative space is where the majority of your frame is filled with pretty much nothing. It may seem like a bad thing on the surface, but it can be really impactful. The reason it's called negative space is because it's an offset from the positive aspects of your photograph, which is what you want people's eye to be drawn to. So your subject is seen as the positive and the space surrounding it is seen as the negative. I think it's a really poor term, really. I think it's much more useful to just call it space. So the first scenario where negative space can have a positive impact on our photographs is when we're trying to isolate a subject. This composition that I've just set up here of the barn against the sky surrounded by this bleak area of moorland is a perfect example of this, where I'm projecting the barn above the horizon line so it's being framed by the sky, and the stream is sort of punctuating the grassland as it meanders its way down the valley. We've got plenty of interest here for our eye to be drawn to, but at the same time we are isolating it. There's nothing else drawing our eye away and distracting us from looking at what it is that I want you to look at in this frame. The key thing to look out for when you're trying to isolate a subject in negative space is contrast. That could be tonal contrast, where your subject is lighter or darker than its background, or it could be colour contrast, where the colour of your subject stands out and pops against the colour of the background. Maybe a complementary colour scheme, where your colours of your subject and background are opposite each other on the colour wheel. The second scenario, where negative space can be really positive in our photographs, is when we're trying to emphasise a sense of size and scale. For this composition, I've moved my camera to a lower angle down by the stream and tried to project the barn up above the horizon line even more. So we're taking that concept of making our photographs stand out in amongst this negative space, but we're also making it larger by getting down to that lower angle, making it look a lot bigger and more impressive within our frame. I mean, look at it in size comparison to me. I look absolutely tiny. Once we realise that negative space can help us to emphasise that sense of size and scale, we can start to play around with perspective. I've come round to the other side of the barn now, and instead of projecting it up above the horizon line, I've tucked it down below. The barn is still standing out, but instead of the emphasis being on the size and scale of the barn, it's now switched to the bleakness of the landscape surrounding it. Which leads me neatly on to the third scenario where negative space is absolutely brilliant in our photographs. And that's when we're trying to create a sense of mood and atmosphere in our pictures. Take this setup that I've got here. We've got the stream leading out to the horizon, but the horizon is clouded by that mist, which is stopping your eye from going much further, other than getting a tantalising glimpse of the trees on the horizon. All of the lines within this composition are leading you towards the barn, which on a bleak day like today could be seen as our salvation, somewhere that we can shelter from these conditions that keep rolling in. Finding bleak and moody subjects and locations is obviously key to creating that atmosphere. But negative space can add to that feeling of isolation, where you are simply framing your subject within that space and making it stand out amongst the bleakness of its surroundings. Before I wrap up, I think there are a few pertinent points that I need to make about space in general within our photographs, where people can often slip up. First of all, balance is a huge part of photography composition, and space plays a really big role within that balance. Take this composition here. If I wasn't in it, let me just nip out of it for a moment, you will see that the majority of what's going on in terms of detail within this frame is on the left-hand side, with the rock, the barn and the stream. Whereas there's nothing really going on that right-hand side. If I just nip back in again and fill that right-hand side, then the scene becomes a lot more balanced. So we have to be aware of where we're fitting the elements within our frame with the space in order to create that air of equilibrium from our pictures. The other thing that we've got to be careful of is space around our subjects. You could say that this composition works better because we've balanced either side of the frame out. But this rock down here, for me, is quite distracting because it's almost drawing your eye down to the bottom left-hand corner of the photograph, rather than the barn playing the main role. So instead, what we can do is allow a little bit more space around the edge of this rock by maybe lowering our angle slightly or flattening down that perspective. So the rock then becomes a visual stepping stone to the barn rather than taking over and becoming a distraction. I must also address the negative space being used constructively versus too much of nothing argument. I would suggest with a frame like this, there is just a little bit too much sky. Yes, the barn stands out and it's isolated and it might give a feeling of bleakness and isolation, but because there isn't too much going on in the sky and everything is tucked down in that bottom third, I think the balance of this composition is just slightly out. On a day like today, where the sky doesn't have any detail to it, I think something like this works much better, where we're bringing the subject more centrally into the frame and offsetting the negative space of the sky with the negative space of the grass around the foreground. It just seems to add more balance to the scene. I like to think of space in composition as padding for your subject. The more you use, the more it will stand out and add that layer of protection from distractions, things that might draw your eye away from where you want it to look. So hopefully you now realise that there's nothing negative about space in photography. In fact, it's all very positive if it's used correctly. So follow the pointers that I've shared with you in this video and you won't go far wrong. And if you want to take your composition a step further, watch this video next. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.